All right. Welcome everybody. It's great to see you, and thanks for joining for this discussion of this wonderful new book, Planet Palm by Jocelyn Zuckerman. My name is Glenn Hurwitz. I'm the CEO and founder of Mighty Earth. Mighty Earth is a global environmental advocacy organization. We work all around the world to protect nature, break the link between environmental destruction and economic growth. We are have done a lot of work in the palm oil industry to reduce deforestation and protect land rights. We also have, as we'll discuss, spread that model to the rubber industry, especially in the Mekong, cocoa in Africa, and our big effort right now is to decarbonize the meat industry, which is the largest driver of deforestation. We've drawn a lot of lessons from what's happened in the palm oil industry, which we'll hear about today. Mighty Earth is a young, growing organization, but we really started our work in the palm oil industry many years ago, and it's been a source of huge challenge, but also amazing progress, as we'll hear about. And I think the headline is, the palm oil industry has destroyed more than 30,000 square miles of rainforest, primarily but not exclusively in Southeast Asia, and has also set a model for commodity deforestation. Yet we've seen deforestation decline by more than 90% in the palm oil industry. So it's a fascinating story, and one we'll hear about from our guests today, starting with Jocelyn Zuckerman, who is the former deputy editor of Gourmet. She was the articles editor of On Earth magazine and executive editor of Modern Farmer. She's an alumna of Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, and has written for many publications, including Fast Company, American Prospect, Vogue. If you have not purchased this book, Planet Palm, How Palm Oil Ended Up in Everything and Endangered the World, I strongly encourage you to do so. It's utterly fascinating. As you may have seen from my invitation, I feel like I know a lot about palm oil from having worked on it for many years and working to change the industry, but I learned so much about its history, about its ties with empire, and sort of the emergence of commercial food industry, and as well as personal care. And so I think you'll be persuaded by listening to her, but I strongly recommend it. And then I'm also very happy to introduce Ashoka Mukpo, who's a journalist with Manga Bay, which is itself the leading conservation website. He previously was a staff reporter at the American Civil Liberties Union and a freelancer based in West Africa, which is actually the home of palm oil. As I learned more about Ashoka, he has many layers to him. He was identified as a reincarnated llama as an infant, but decided to pursue other ways of helping his fellow creatures, including through his brilliant journalism. So I'm very happy to have him. And then later we'll have Anissa Rahmawati, Mighty Earth's Indonesia representative. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Ashoka, who's going to lead the conversation with Jocelyn today. It's a pleasure to have you, and enjoy the conversation. We'll open it up for questions after Ashoka's initial interview.
Great, thanks so much, Glenn. Well, Jocelyn, it feels like it's a long time since we first met in the palm oil plantations of Liberia. In around 2013, Jocelyn and I were sort of working together. She was reporting in the field, and I was working with the Friends of the Earth local chapter to monitor some of the activities of the Indonesian and Malaysian companies that were present there. And it's been really exciting to watch your journey through the world of palm oil since then. And I feel like maybe an opening question is, what do you know about palm oil now that you didn't back then?
Well, basically, I knew nothing back then. I mean, if you recall, the story I was reporting was about land grabs. That was what I pitched to the magazine and what I went down there to report. And it was when I got down there that I saw, oh, this all has to do with palm oil. And I didn't know anything. You might remember towards the end of the trip, I was like, can we go somewhere where I can like see these fruits or see this oil? I have no idea how it grows, because the terrain we saw was basically had just been cleared. I mean, we drove for miles and miles where they just cut down the rainforest. And then we also saw some young oil palm plantations, but I didn't see any, grown trees. And as I said, I had no idea what the fruit looked like. So I knew I knew nothing. I had a vague idea about like Girl Scouts and orangutans, maybe from the news from years earlier. But other than that, I didn't know anything. So I sort of came back home and learned all about what was happening in Southeast Asia. And then I started researching the history, which I just, I had no idea of the connections to slavery, the connections to empire, really nothing at all. So there was a lot.
Yeah, that's a good segue into the next question. I mean, as someone who's reported on palm oil, it feels like a lot of us are really siloed into, we're working in Indonesia, or we're working in West Africa, and it's kind of hard to see this big historical and current events picture across these different regions. And I thought one of the things that your book did really well was give people a really broad overview of not just the current state of play of palm oil, but, the history of where it came from, and how some of the problems I think that advocates would say they're working on now are very, very well mirrored by what was going on 150 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So as someone who's really interested in West Africa in particular, could you talk a little bit about that history? I thought it was really particularly fascinating how tied palm oil was to the emergence of colonialism in Nigeria. So what was that like?
So the Europeans started sourcing palm oil in the 1700s for lighting lamps and for making soap, eventually for making margarine. And then there was this guy, George Goldie. He was sort of an aristocrat, grew up in a very wealthy family, but he was sort of a ne'er-do-well. He sort of screwed up on various fronts. But at one point in 1870, I believe, one of his brothers said that he had just bailed out his father-in-law by buying his trading company. And this trading company had been sourcing palm oil from the West African coast. So Goldie thought, okay, maybe I'll, take that over and see what I can do. He was actually a really smart guy. He was just kind of a screw up. So he went down there and sort of looked at the system that was in place for trading palm oil. It was mostly traders from Liverpool who went down and they stayed offshore while these middlemen sent canoes up into so the palm oil groves were up above this, the Niger Delta where all the rivers were. And these middlemen would go up and source the palm oil and then bring it back down, and then they would trade it with the European traders. It was exactly the way the slave trade had worked. They had bought these humans from the interior, brought them down in the canoes, and then these middlemen were sort of in charge of brokering, trading these humans for the various things they were trading them for. Anyway, so when the slave trade was outlawed, they basically slid the palm oil trade right into this infrastructure that was already there. And so this guy Goldie went down there and he saw, oh wait, all these African middlemen are sort of in charge of this. And he was like, I want to be in charge. So he basically slowly, with a lot of coercion and violence, took a monopoly on started going up the rivers and trading himself and building these factories, using gunboats to fire into villages, and took over the whole palm oil trade, basically. And then he also had people, eventually the British government got involved because he kept saying, this trade is now worth a lot of money and these natives are unruly and we need to keep them in line. So we're going to need more power from the government to back us. Which eventually happened. And so he and his folks would sort of travel throughout these villages and coerce different chiefs and kings to sign agreements with them. And then when there was the conference in Berlin in 1885, where the European powers were sort of dividing up Africa, Goldie was there, but he was in the background, but he provided all of these contracts that these chiefs had signed to show, we are preeminent in this region. We're sort of in charge of it. So you should just be giving that to us. And that's basically how Britain got Nigeria for a colony of its own, through the shenanigans of this man Goldie and through the palm oil trade.
Yeah, I thought a really fascinating section in that book was when you talked about some of these local traders, the kings and chiefs and various sort of middlemen in the Niger Delta who at one point had a sort of profitable slice of the trade that kind of got shut out. Who were those folks and what was that process of assuming control from them like? There
was one in particular that I wrote about. I'm looking for his picture. His name was Jaja, and he's still known as like the greatest trader in, I don't know if you can see that, in in Nigeria. So he was actually born a slave. So there's a sort of, there was a system of slavery that was in place in Africa. It was very different from the chattel slavery that we know about, the transatlantic slave trade. But anyway, he had begun as a slave and then sort of watched the industry all as he was growing up, figured out exactly how it all worked, and he ascended to become the main trader until Goldie came along. And basically the consul at the time invited him aboard a boat because he said, we're not happy with your monopoly in this particular area. We're not going to do anything bad. We just want to talk about it. First, he said, no, I'm not going on your boat. I don't believe you people. And so finally they said, no, really, we promise we won't do anything bad. So he went on the boat and they said, either, you need to leave or we're taking over your entire trade. So they sent him to Ghana for a sham trial and then they exiled him to the Caribbean. His obit appeared in the New York Times, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, like where did you find some of this information? It feels like your book seems like it's one of the first places that all this stuff is laid out. I imagine that there was a lot of leafing through dusty documents and old books. So, where did you find this stuff?
I'm a little ashamed to say I did not. I never landed in an archive. I didn't report from Nigeria. I would have liked to, but I only had so much money to travel to all these different places. But I got one of my daughters makes fun of me because I have all these like super obscure books. This is the one. She was like, it's so specific. But I guess you find your topic and you can find lots of good old books. This one is Merchant Prince of the Niger Delta and Colonialism in the Congo Basin, 1880 to 1940. And then there was this one book on Goldie. He actually, right before he died, he tore up all, or probably burnt all of his papers, and he told his children that they were not allowed to ever write about him. But this guy did. He was in the archives in Nigeria and had access to all these government cables and things. So this is basically a primary resource, and I relied on that. There's also the book, The Scramble for Africa, Thomas Pakenham. So I sort of that was sort of good for a big picture. And then from there, I kind of drilled down into the different areas.
Yeah, just leafing through all the bestsellers, huh?
Exactly.
Kind of like
I wanted to tell this sweeping picture, but it's hard. You get down in the weeds, and there's so much interesting stuff. So it was definitely a challenge to sort of, just do sort of a broad sweep of these different facets.
Yeah, you managed to tell a lot of really complicated stories very concisely. That's part of what I really liked about the book. To kind of shift regions a little bit, I really like that you covered Honduras in your book. When we think about palm oil, it feels like Indonesia, Malaysia, those are the places that are really predominant in our minds. And then kind of to a lesser extent, I think Africa too, both in terms of its origins, where some of the big high profile, fights over land have happened in the past 10 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
But Central America is actually a big region for palm oil, right? And I wonder, what did you see there that felt similar and different to other places?
What was amazing was it felt so similar everywhere I went. It was like people told me the same stories about how their river was polluted, about how they were kicked off the land. One amazing thing, it's actually from, there's a picture in the book of this fish taken in Guatemala, but they said that the river was so polluted. This is after the Repsa, the palm oil company Repsa, their pools had overflowed and this river was completely polluted. And they said, I was at sort of a village meeting, and they said, at this point, there's only one type of fish that can survive in the river. And they sent a teenager down to get it, and they brought back this, I say in the book that it looked like an armored military aircraft. I mean, it's just this solid, sort of horrible looking thing. And they said, these are the only fish that are left. And when the women go to do their wash, the fish bite them on the ankles. Anyway, in Sumatra, they said the exact same thing. They said there's only one fish that survives in the river, this kind of catfish. So it was amazing. I first of all, I just didn't know that the industry was growing so much in Honduras and Guatemala. Also so fascinating was, the links to Chiquita and United Fruit. And so the history, between the sort of colonialism and imperialism and then today's industry, there's just, a straight line in so many of these different places.
Yeah, really.
Stories.
Yeah, I really sort of thought about that a little bit. I think I mentioned in the review that I did that I read part of your Indonesia piece while I was reading another book
Right.
by a guy named Vincent Bevins, who kind of goes through the genocide and sort of the CIA taught, ties to that in 1965. And I, also felt that in the Honduras section, sort of thinking about United Fruit Company and some of its involvement in political instability in Central America. Is that something that sort of popped out at you that kind of ties between how the industry functions and big political events you might not have associated with them on face value?
Very much, which is why I really wanted to go into that in the book. It was a challenge because I thought, is this not relevant to the present day palm oil industry? But it does seem to me that it's very relevant, that there's, these sort of trends of economic patterns, racism, imperialism, as I said. So, yeah.
Yeah. You went to a lot of places, a lot of places that looked hot and tough to reach, and in some cases potentially even dangerous. What was it like reporting this book?
It was scary in Guatemala and Honduras. I think that's where because it's, as you know, it's sort of bound up in the drug trade. So, and there's a lot of violence in, certainly in Honduras. And I say in the book, in this little hotel I stayed in San Pedro Sula, somebody from the ILRF, International Labor Rights Forum, had recommended it because that's where they stay. And she said it's, it seemed relatively safe. It's a little hotel. There were two guys with big guns standing in the lobby. So, it just felt, and as I also say, at one point we were sort of in traffic coming back from these plantations at night. And I sort of pride myself on being a fearless traveler, and we were stuck in traffic, and I was afraid that somebody could just, as I said, there's so many guns there. Again, we can look at our complicity in that situation, but so that was kind of scary. I felt less scared in Africa and in Southeast Asia, maybe stupidly in the case of Indonesia, because at one point I was reporting in Sumatra with an Indonesian photographer, and we got stuck. As you know, these plantations go on just for miles and miles, and they look exactly the same. So you don't know if you're just driving in circles a lot of the time. I got lost, we got lost so many times. So we were in this really big one trying to find particular people to talk to, and the sun started going down, and we realized there's no way we're going to find our way out of here. So we found this guy, a chief in a little village, who said we could sleep on his floor. So it was me and my translator fixer guy, and also Sumatran, and this photographer from Jakarta. And we were sleeping on the floor of this house. And at one point he looked outside, and there was a guy from the, it's called the Mobile Brigade Corps. It's like the National Police. This guy was sitting on the porch talking to this other guy with his gun perched next to him. And the photographer was freaking out. He was so, I just thought, oh, whatever. I didn't realize, how serious it could be. And he said, what if he confiscates my camera? He could throw us in jail. And sort of looking at how he was responding, I was like, oh, I guess this is maybe a little more dangerous. And as we know, there have been various, there's been a lot of violence related to activists in Indonesia butting up against the industry there. So, those were the main things. And so back to Guatemala, there was one morning where I was at breakfast next to these guys who looked very sort of coked up, and they had lots of chunky jewelry, and they looked sort of just like out of the movie Traffic. And again, it's a fine line between sort of paranoid. I thought, that I'm reporting on palm oil. Maybe this company has to do with, or like they don't care about me. It's hard to gauge when you're in danger and when you're just being completely paranoid. So, but it was definitely in Central America that I felt the most scared.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, Jocelyn and I have talked about this a bit, but I just got back from Petén, the region that you visited and wrote about a little bit. And definitely felt that too. There's some parallels, I think, to the Wild West. A little bit, it's like a lot of ranchers with guns on their hips and cattle everywhere. The forest is just sort of vanishing in certain parts of it, partially because of palm oil. And yeah, those activists that you spent some time with in Indonesia, I thought that was a really kind of compelling part of the book, that they're going undercover, they're using sort of subterfuge kind of things. I mean, what was it like to spend time with those folks?
It was kind of amazing. I think it was 5 days, and I was with like 6 guys, I think, including we had two drivers because we had two vehicles. None of them spoke English, and I don't speak Bahasa. So there was a guy from the organization Eyes on the Forest who was translating for me. His English wasn't great either, so it was a little broken up, but they were amazing. I mean, they're so dedicated to what they do. So this work involves going to these very remote places, and as I said, sort of undercover. So they'll act as like businessmen scouting for land, or like people from an NGO, and they were kind of nerds. They were like hunched over their computers in the morning. They worked with like satellite data and import maps and things. But then they would go out and just kind of start making small talk with, like, at one point there was a guy, a driver who had a truck full of oil palm fruit, and it was clear that it was from a national park that was right close by. So it was illegal fruit. And the sort of main investigator went up to him, just started sort of chatting him up, like, so, first he said, like, is this where we come to see the Sumatran tigers? And then the guy was like, I don't think so. But then he was like, so how was the harvest? Where are you taking your fruit? And the guy said he's taking it to Tebow, I think he said. And he said, oh, I have an uncle who lives in Tebow. His name is something. Or the other guy said, he said, what's your trader's name? And he said, Teddy. And he said, oh, my uncle's name is Teddy. What's your Teddy's last name? Like, totally bullshitting the guy to get all the information. And then one of the was taking pictures of his license plate. And then what they do is they just sort of sit and wait and watch for the guy to go to see where he's taking this illicit fruit. And then we pulled out behind this truck to follow it to the mill so that they could then trace where the mill is sending the fruit to what refinery, and if that's then landing in products of PepsiCo or Procter & Gamble. Or so they were great. I mean, as I said, it was a funny situation because we couldn't communicate very well, and we were together all day long, eating every meal together. A lot of smiling and sort of laughter, but I was very impressed with their work. They were really cool.
Yeah, it's got to be dangerous.
Yeah, for them, definitely.
Did people talk to you at all about those types of risks that they take, whether it's activists or journalists, and why they feel like it's worth it?
Yeah, I mean, there's one guy, I think you met with him recently in Guatemala. And I met with him in a cafe in Guatemala City. He had a little suitcase. He said he was moving around. He had come out, in public against this company that had polluted the river. And he said definitely he had threats on his life, and so was moving around from house to house. And I had actually met him the year before in Washington, D.C., with a panel for the Committee to Protect Journalists, where Berta, I'm not sure how we pronounce her last name, Caceres from Honduras, was speaking. She was talking about sort of the danger. This was not necessarily linked to the oil palm industry, but to extractive companies in Honduras. And as we all know, she was murdered. And she had given a speech in DC, and I interviewed her afterward. And I said, do you feel like being here, publicly in DC makes you more safe or less safe because of the, and she was like, well, it's a fine line because they're mad at me for, exposing this issue internationally, but also, the eyes of the world are sort of now on me. So maybe that provides a layer of protection. And soon after that, she was murdered. So yeah, they definitely am aware of the risks. Another guy in Guatemala told me, sorry, he, I don't think he showed it to me, but he said that he had a gun under his bed, and he was like, I hate it. It's so terrible, but it's only if somebody comes for my family.
Yeah, so you got to hide and play the side, huh?
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of shift a little bit. I know we sort of don't have like a ton of time left, but one of the things that at Manga Bay we've been talking about a lot lately is these certification programs, not just for palm oil, but for soy and timber, whether it's FSC or Roundtable on Responsible Soy, or in palm oil's case, the RSPO. And I think there's a lot of debate right now. It's like, are these certification systems working? Do they produce the outcomes that they claim to produce? And I'm curious if you ran across kind of views on the RSPO and what you were hearing from folks.
Yeah, most people weren't terribly impressed. I interviewed the then CEO, and I worked with sort of another guy at RSPO. They're all very nice people, but I just feel like it's not the regulations aren't strict enough, and the auditing system. There was just a report, I think, like within the last couple of months, from a Swiss organization. Glenn, you would know, Meal something, looking at the RSPO again, and a lot of the same complaints. I mean, I believe it's still the situation that the companies that are being audited hire the auditors. So you've got a conflict of interest right there. And when I met with plantation workers in Honduras, and I heard the same thing in other places, they told me, oh yeah, the RSPO was just here, I think a week ago. And they said, one, we were coached before they came. They had brochures with our talking points, what we were supposed to say about how our working conditions were so good, and you know, all the sustainable ways that we're growing palm oil. And then they said, when we were being interviewed by the auditors, our manager was standing next to us, so we had to say nice things. And then they said afterward, people who didn't say nice things were punished or fired, and the ones who did were given banquets with soda and food. And so that's one problem. And then it just seems to me that the complaint system is very slow. I know a lot of complaints have sat in there for years. And then also there are companies, as you know, GVL being one of them, if they're told, you know, if they're called out by the RSPO for doing something bad, rather than dealing with it, they quit the organization. So that's not a great system. I know they've been working on sort of making the regulations tighter, and I think it's getting better, but most of the folks I talked to did not feel like that was the main mechanism by which the industry was sort of cleaning up its act. Glenn might be able to.
Yeah, I think I probably only have time for about one more question. So I'm going to use that to ask you, is there any place that you felt like you saw sustainable palm oil? And if so,
you know, I actually did. I didn't put this in the book. I think I decided in the end it just felt too small, but I did go to Ecuador and spend time. I don't know if you folks are familiar with this organization, Natural Habitats. They work with smallholder farmers, and I visited a couple of their farms, and they were intercropping with passion fruit. So they were sort of lively farms with horses and cows and different crops. And they had a health center, and they had a school. The farmers, one of them was growing his biodynamically. He had like a compost tea. He was very sort of hippie. So that seemed sustainable, and it seemed like the sort of human rights and labor issues were in line. The problem was that it's quite small. I mean, they're trying to grow it, and they have a campaign called Palm Done Right. But originally, when I had first reported on it, they were also working in Sierra Leone, and they were hoping to expand, I believe, to Ghana. And now it's just in Ecuador. So I'm not sure, you know, why it's constricted rather than grown. I don't know what the situation is there, but so I think it's, you know, it's certainly possible to grow it in a sustainable way. I just think that monoculture plantations are the problem.
Well, I don't know, Megan, do you want to maybe thank you so much, Jocelyn? It's, you know, like I said, it's been a great, you know, it was a really great book to read. Yeah, I'm not sure if there are people who might have questions to.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions in the chat. Thanks so much, Jocelyn. And I want to get to them, but I did want to just briefly give a chance to Anissa to share her perspective on the book, and from her perspective, not only as an Indonesian, but somebody who's been on the front lines of fighting deforestation for palm oil for several years. Anissa is currently the Indonesian advocate for Mighty Earth, but previously worked for Greenpeace as their senior forest campaigner in Indonesia, has a number of degrees from international universities, and is really steeped in what's happening. And I guess just to frame this for you, Anissa, I guess I would ask you, now the palm oil industry has a really terrible and destructive history that we've been hearing about, and it's even where there are sort of established plantations with the water pollution and human rights issues, worker issues, it's very bad. However, I think due to a variety of factors, including NGO work and civil society efforts, both in Indonesia and other places where palm oil is grown, we have seen deforestation decline dramatically. And a lot of that has been driven by private sector changes. However, in Indonesia, in the last few years, the government has been more has made at least hostile noises about environmental protection. There's been closing space for civil society. How do you explain that paradox between, on the one hand, greater private sector action and 90% decline in deforestation for palm oil, and then on the other hand, that the government is seemingly creating more pressure and align with some of the worst deforesters? Anissa, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. Books regarding your question about Indonesia and the political side of Indonesia regarding palm oil. I thought I know all the things about palm oil until this book reveals the history and complexity as well as myriad.
Anissa, I think you're having some challenge with the internet connection. We're having a hard time hearing you, Anissa. Maybe if you could turn off your video, see if that works better.
Okay. Hello. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, for Indonesia, palm oil have been the national income sources, so that's why it is heavily protected by election in the local and the national election, and they are hiding behind the smallholders, saying palm oil is creating prosperity for them to reduce poverty. But actually, the palm oil industry is dominating.
Anissa, unfortunately,
and cannot be compared with the smallholder. Hello. Something that everyone.
Yeah, go ahead. The internet's choppy, but keep going for a little bit. And
yeah, surely that Indonesia must grow the economy, but.
All right, I think it's choppy. Maybe we'll take some other questions.
Country and the extractive industry destroying the valuable forest. Hello.
Yeah, you're going in and out. Maybe we could take some other questions, and then you could, if you sign back in, we'll try to give you the floor again because it's going in and out. All right, maybe I'll hand it over to Ashoka for now, and hopefully we'll be able to get back to Anissa to do questions. Either I think there's some in the chat, and then also there's people are welcome to raise their hand. Go ahead, Ashoka.
Sure, I'm happy to kind of ask a question to Jocelyn about that. I mean, I feel like that's probably one of the hardest questions with all of this. So, her connection problems means we're going to have to shine a spotlight on you, Jocelyn, to answer this. I think it's this, and this came up a lot for me when I was doing some advocacy at West Africa around palm oil, is that there is the reality that the cultivation of this crop is happening in places where people are very poor. Countries don't have a whole lot of, products to sell. Their terms of trade are poor, and, what we call development. And so there's counter reaction to hiring people in poverty. And you get at this in your book, this idea of like, we're protecting oil and answer for this dilemma, because it's something that definitely
this dilemma being like,
points.
Who are we to say this industry is bad as Westerners, or?
Right, like the dilemma of when people come back and say, well, we have to do something to, reduce poverty. We have to do something to give people a leg up. And this is an option. Why would you want this to be taken off the table? What would you respond to?
Of course, I totally agree with that. But I just think that given this moment in history with climate change and biodiversity, literal emergencies, that this needs to be looked at holistically, and also obesity and malnutrition. So yeah, there are a lot of industries that I think you could start in these places. I don't think you need to be growing a vegetable oil that is 70% of which is going to processed foods, much of which is then being dumped in these poorer countries as well. So and chopping down rainforests to do that. So I think that's sort of an easy out, and it seems to me that the folks I talked to on the ground. I just read an article the other day about GV, about folks in Sino County in Liberia. I think 400 of them or something were fired given COVID. And they said, we signed this deal. We said, okay, we'll give you our land if, because we're going to get these jobs. And they're like, now we have no land, we have no place to farm, and we have no jobs. And the company's like, sorry, we were losing money because of COVID, so we can't do that. So, I think governments need to do a better job making those companies sign deals that are going to benefit the people and not just rich politicians in Monrovia or and bankers, in DC and New York. And again, it's like a much bigger systemic problem, I think, but I think it needs to be looked at in the context of climate change and global health and biodiversity.
Yeah.
Well, Anissa's back. Let's give her another shot to talk about her perspective and answer the question she was answering. Anissa?
Hello. Can you hear?
I think so. Well, unfortunately, not.
Oh dear. Hello.
Okay, go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, regarding your questions about the paradox. Indonesia has hit the record of declining the deforestation rate, and it is also kind of a hope for us, thanks to the CSO campaign for the non-deforestation, no pit, no exploitation. Thinking space of democracy, weakening the corruption clearance body at the moment, and the investor red carpet via omnibus law. So the omnibus law is actually kind of a law that can hit everything.
Anissa, unfortunately, you're coming
Indonesia
in and out.
Without having, for example, environmental assessment. And moreover, with the coming general election 2024, I'm so worried, and I would say that it is not easy for coming works on. We can
Anissa,
start and the movement, and we hope it will something bigger to save our planet. Hello.
Yeah, it's we heard some pearls of wisdom in there, but it's going in and out. So I think we'll have to find another way to share your thoughts, perhaps in a blog post or otherwise. But thank you for that. I know from what I heard, it was very
so hard. Sorry about that.
insightful. No worries. But maybe Ashok, I could hand it back to you to sort of facilitate some of the questions, and I just encourage people to raise their hands or put a note in the chat if they'd like to ask questions.
Sure. So I think this question that we have from Dan Zarin feels like it sort of follows on this question of, okay, so you severely limit the palm oil industry's capacity to expand and move into new markets. Doesn't that just mean that the global demand for oil products is going to shift to soy and other vegetable oils that are also destructive to the environment?
Probably in large part, but that's also why I keep making the bigger point that we don't need this much vegetable oil in the global diet. We never had it before. It's mostly going to garbage foods. So I think, none of these arguments can be made in isolation, that it needs to be. And I sort of feel like, given the pandemic, given the climate emergency, like there now may be the space to talk about these things in concert. Like, we've got a finite amount of land, we've got finite amount of tropical rainforests that absolutely need to remain standing, and peatlands. And also, not all crops need to grow at 10 degrees to the north and south of the equator, where the tropical rainforests and the peatlands are. So, yeah, that's a problem. It all needs to be sort of looked at in concert, but also in the context of the fact, like, do we need this much vegetable oil in the diet? Absolutely not.
I want to encourage anyone who's joining us, if you have comments, question, anything you'd like to share, please put it in the chat. And I'll,
Can I ask
Yeah.
a question to Glenn?
Yes, of course.
There's been a couple initiatives announced recently, including that LEAF one that was announced during the climate summit. And I keep making reference to sort of the climate emergency and the biodiversity emergency and global health. It feels to me a little bit like maybe people are, again, partly because of the pandemic, are starting to realize, all right, we are really screwed, backs against the wall. We need to look at this and find solutions in terms of divesting from fossil fuels, but also in terms of deforestation and biodiversity. Do you feel like that, or am I deluding myself?
It's a great question. I think in many industries there is, and I think certainly from a popular level, yes, there's demand and pressure for action, and I think we're seeing that in some industries and from some government policies in increased action. I mean, I think the deforestation in the palm oil industry is part of that. It's also happened substantially in the pulp and paper industry in Southeast Asia, and it's come from, in great measure, significant efforts in Indonesia and internationally to create pressure on that, and that has paid dividends in terms of private sector action. But what we're seeing now also is, for the first time, some of the palm oil companies who caused so much damage historically have now started to avoid deforestation, but we've been frustrated that they haven't taken proactive steps to actually invest in conservation and restoration to undo some of the damage, at least, that they've done in the past. This organization called Lestari Capital just launched the Rimba Collective with some of the big palm oil companies and palm oil users to invest $1 billion in conserving and restoring forests over the next 25 years. Now, it's a great announcement. We have to make sure that they actually deliver on that and deliver on it in a way that actually conserves and restores forests. And then on top of that, as you mentioned, the UK, Norwegian, and other governments launched, and the US launched this LEAF initiative with many just sort of mainstream companies, Amazon, Goldman Sachs, and others, to put another $1 billion into forest conservation. And on top of the private sector initiatives, I think that can also go far towards actually creating value in having standing forests and standing trees, so that people, and companies don't feel as much of an alternative between deforestation for commodity agriculture and conservation, and so that there's actually an economic incentive for conservation. Finally, I would just say, whether it's palm oil or rubber or cocoa or animal feed, soy or cattle, the fundamental dynamic is that deforestation is not necessary. There are 1.6 billion acres of lands previously deforested, at least around the world, where you can expand these crops without driving deforestation. There's a lot of potential for yield improvement in some of them. And I think what the palm oil industry has done is really take advantage of that opportunity to expand on degraded land, some yield improvement, instead of deforestation. And it needs to be more widespread. We're really concerned, as I think Anissa was going to talk about, about the potential for going backwards despite the progress. But we haven't seen that happen as much in some of those other industries, notably the meat industry. And so that I think when I read your book, I thought there were a lot of lessons from the story of the palm oil industry, both its history and how it's changed, that could be applied elsewhere.
Anissa's trying to answer, she says.
And maybe Anissa, you could, I'll share Anissa's, she just sent to the panelists, but I'll share it with everybody. So this is what I am writing is from Anissa.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat here. Do we want to?
Yeah, go for it.
This? Robin Barr had an interesting question. She asks, given the colonial history of palm oil, what would decolonizing palm oil look like? Got any thoughts on that, Joss?
I have an example in my epilogue. It's not quite decolonizing palm oil, but it's sort of certainly speaks to that concept anyway. And it's about a Dutch artist named Renzo Martens, who he made a documentary in 2008 called Enjoy Poverty, all shot in the Belgian Congo and all about sort of global inequity and the legacies of colonialism. And he now has just come out with another documentary. It's called The White Cube. What he did was he worked with a group of local Congolese to build a museum. First of all, they started doing art classes with instructors from Kinshasa. In this town, it's called Lusanga. It was actually the original place where William Lever, the founder of what would become Unilever, went and used forced labor from the Congo to get this palm oil that he then shipped back to the UK to build his empire. Anyway, when he went to this place, Lusanga, he renamed it Leverville. It's now back to Lusanga, and these artists who live there they've gotten rid of the oil palm plantations, and now they're making art and selling it sort of around the world, partly with the help of this Dutch artist Renzo Martens. They call it the post-plantation, and the idea is that plantation work, the art that we all enjoy in the Western world in rich countries was sort of built on the back of plantation labor and stolen land, and his idea is to sort of invert the whole thing. That on this post-plantation, they're supporting themselves by making art that they're selling in the Western world, and what they're doing is buying back the land and building this whole agroforestry system so that they can use the land to nourish themselves rather to provide an export commodity from which they get very little.
Yeah, it seems like at least part of this is about who profits, right? Like even, I was thinking sort of this question of, is this good for development? It's sort of like, well, where's the money going? It's a big difference between if it's just going to somebody who's going to buy a yacht or, property in London versus if it's actually somehow being managed sustainably for the benefit of communities at the local level.
And that they're adding value there at that level so that they can keep more of the profits rather than just exporting the raw material.
Yeah. So this is a good question too. Nathan Koka, sorry if I mispronounced your name, is asking a question that I think is about palm oil, but feels like it's applicable to a lot of trade in both illicit and forest risk products, which is, what are your thoughts on the elephants in the room, which is one, that the biggest markets are China and India, and two, that the fastest growing use is for fuels in Southeast Asia. So for these big consumer companies that might not be as receptive to, the name and shame game that NGOs play, is there anything that people can do to work with them or put pressure on them? Or, did you hear people talk about this?
I'd actually love to push this question to Glenn, because I was interested. The New York Times Magazine, as some of the viewers might know, did an article, it was about 2 years ago, about sort of the biofuels industry and how that was, and biofuels mandates here in the US. And also in Europe had sort of driven deforestation in Indonesia for more palm oil development for biofuels. So I know they mentioned your organization in the article. I was wondering sort of what happened after in terms of reader response, if people sort of got involved in campaigns, and then how sort of your policy has changed or your advocacy has changed in the wake of that.
So, most of the deforestation that you've talked about and the other impacts of palm oil on the human level are primarily due to demand for food, especially in Asian markets. There's also significant use for personal care products like soap, going back to William Lever and Unilever and other companies. In recent years, on top of that, the United States and Europe and now Indonesia itself are burning huge quantities of vegetable oil for biodiesel, including palm oil, as well as ethanol in the United States made from corn. And that uses a tremendous amount of land. And whether it's, from palm oil, it can soy, it can directly drive deforestation in Indonesia or the Amazon, But even where it's ethanol that's grown in the United States, that's displacing crops that then need to be grown elsewhere. And so it can indirectly drive deforestation. I think that was what the New York Times the great, really wonderful New York Times Magazine article delved into. There's been limits in Europe on, that have been adopted on how much palm oil they can use as biodiesel, because of the concern that adding this additional demand where you're, incinerating large amounts of food can increase demand for land and cause additional climate change. I mean, burning palm oil especially, but biodiesel in general is actually way dirtier than oil. It produces way more climate pollution than dirty old oil. And so, we're really concerned about that. We haven't seen much change in the United States, even under the Biden administration. That's something that we are working on, and to just not just target at palm oil, but just generally reduce the use of food-based biofuels that are causing such an enormous.
But wasn't it the restrictions put in place in the EU then had the impact of Indonesia and Malaysia upping their biofuels mandates? So it is.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's hard to say that was necessarily causality. There's a lot of political foment around the issue, but it is true. I think just in general, one of our biggest concerns is that Indonesia in particular has imposed, very large biodiesel mandates.
Is it up to 40% or 30%?
Yeah, or potentially even more in terms of what they're forecasting. They're facing some logistical difficulties in actually doing it. I don't know if Anissa, how your internet connection is going, but this has been an issue of some political debate, and it's a complicated tax policy. But Anissa, do you want to weigh in for a moment on this issue? Perhaps in the chat if we can't hear you. But yeah, I think this is a big part of it. And then, the interesting thing is that many of the palm oil traders, the Western consumer goods companies, and increasingly Asian companies have actually said they're not going to finance deforestation. And that can be for the biofuel companies themselves or others. One of the things that we've been focused on is trying to cover the biggest biofuel companies with strong forest and human rights policies, so that even if they are growing more and more palm oil, which I think has, some of the negative impacts that you articulated in terms of water pollution, et cetera, at least they wouldn't be driving deforestation. We've had some success with changing some of the big biofuel companies in Indonesia to adopt those policies as well.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you folks think? Do we have time for another question, or?
Yeah, maybe one more, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, great. There are three good ones. Let's just start with the first one. So Tom Quo is asking about pressure points for, I guess, campaigners, and he says on the demand side of things, so curbing the amount of vegetable oils in our diet, for example, what are the key points of leverage, retailers, CPGs, et cetera, that should be targeted to help bend the curve? Do you have any thoughts on that, Jocelyn?
I'm also throwing that one to Glenn.
Well, we have a perfect storm model. So we try to bring pressure from, banks, especially the traders that dominate the palm oil industry, consumer goods companies. I think because so much palm oil is actually consumed in Asia, that's where we've been putting most of our attention for the last several years. And I think that is echoed by other commodities. Sometimes the patterns are different, but we really look to find what the particular lever is, whether it's supermarkets for meat or the chocolate companies for cocoa, tire companies for rubber, and pull those. And it's very granular and different.
Here she is.
Anissa? No. All right, well, we're running short on time. So let me conclude by thanking all of you, Ashoka, Jocelyn, Anissa, and then Megan, maybe you could put up the slides. So Mighty Earth is continuing to work on these issues. We're really proud of and happy about the decline in deforestation for palm oil, but also working to spread that success to industries like the meat industry, which drives more deforestation and climate pollution than all these other industries combined. But we definitely need support to do it. We rely on individual donors and to complement some of the institutional support that can go up and down. And so we would really welcome your contributions. You can go to mightyearth.org/donate to give. Also, if you're interested in making a grant through a donor advised fund or as a philanthropy, please reach out to my colleague Kelly O'Brien, who's on the chat today to answer any questions. So please do that. Also purchase Jocelyn's book, which you can do at jocelynzuckerman.com. And but yeah, please, we'd love to have your support so we can continue doing this work. Thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you all for tuning in. We really appreciate it, and do be in touch.
Thank you, Glenn. Thanks, Ashoka. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thanks, folks.
Ciao.